Ledger count.
Got it. Got it.
Well done.
How will we know? How will we know? Oh, yeah. Tabs on that. Yeah. If there are any questions, just put them out of the break. I'll jump in and introduce you now. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy New Year. Welcome back. Just a few reminders that we are recording this class. The recording will be sent to you as soon as it's ready. Usually it's the afternoon after the class, but we ask that you be patient for 48 hours just in case there's any issues with the recording. Do all of you know who John Rothman is? Anyone here that doesn't? So without further ado, our resident expert.
Next week.
Oh, reminder, next week is a holiday. Winter session is hard because we start classes and then we have a holiday right away. So next week is a holiday. So your next class after today will be on January 22nd. Now, without further ado, our resident expert on everything politics, John Rothman.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
I love those modest introductions. Now, you should know there are more of you listening online at this moment. So I want to set some rules for this class. The first thing is there will be homework. There go my ratings, Derek. You are required to listen to the news. And it is important each week because I can't cover everything. Things move so quickly that you write down questions so that I know what you want to talk about. And I will try to answer those questions in class. Carla is taking care of those of you who are listening online, and we will try to answer questions. Number two, I am not a prophet. And the worst thing is that this is being recorded, which means that you will find out all the things I said that were wrong and throw them right back at me, which is completely all right. This course is divided into two parts. Now we're doing the preliminary campaign through the end of this class, which essentially is the end of February. In September, I'll teach part two, the making of the president 2024, and we'll deal with what happens in that campaign. I want also to be clear that I have biases. My job in this class is to try not to convey my biases, but rather to give you as clear a picture as I can. Fortunately, when I was in high school and in college, my speech coaches required me to present positions and then with a clap of the hand, present the other side. So my job here is not one of advocacy, although you may detect in my general approach a certain bias. That's not necessarily a bad thing. And if you disagree with me, you must speak up. This is not a class where I know everything, or where all of my, don't tell my wife I said that, or that all of my answers are perfect. This class will be integrated into several different aspects. We will talk about the general demeanor of the campaign so far. We will talk about the upcoming caucus, which is next week in Iowa. We will then turn our attention to New Hampshire and South Carolina. If you believe the conventional wisdom, we will know who the Republican nominee will be by the time we hit South Carolina. If you believe the conventional wisdom, which may be precise and accurate, but you never know. I am going to integrate into this class issues. So whether it is what's going on in the Middle East, whether it is Ukraine, whether it is the question of whether we will have a secure southern border, why am I integrating those into this class? Because all of them relate to the presidential campaign. America is not an island. And although our domestic concerns are real, the price of oil, the price of what we do at the grocery store, the question of what Congress does or does not do with the debt ceiling, all of these issues will have a profound impact on this election. So let me step back and try now to set this up. This last weekend, we heard two visions of America. We heard President Biden speaking from Delaware, from Valley Forge, describing his feeling that what happened on January 6th, 3 years ago, was an assault on democracy. He has very clearly defined the campaign as his vision of America is more than just a vision, it is what must be the reality. And essentially, he accused Donald Trump by name of being undemocratic, of trying to steal a presidential election, and he made no bones about his position. Donald Trump spoke Friday as well, and then on Saturday and Sunday again. He made clear in his presentation that he views Joe Biden as the enemy of democracy. He believes that he won the election of 2020 and that it was stolen from him. His view of America is a very different view than the one offered by President Biden. In 1984, and I don't know if Howard Nemirovsky is listening at this very moment, you know, his wife Jackie died, and we all send deepest sympathy. I attended the Democratic National Convention here in San Francisco, and Mario Cuomo, who was then governor of New York, gave a speech. Now, Howard was sitting with me. We had the opportunity to talk about it. And if you remember that great convention keynote, and it was riveting, I have to tell you, he described what Ronald Reagan viewed as a city on the hill versus what the Democrats maintained, that you had to look at what was happening on the ground. And what Cuomo did in his speech was to paint a stark picture of two Americas. May I tell you, what he painted as a picture is nothing compared to the two Americas we face today. I want to use several illustrations from history, and you will note during the course of this class that I will be integrating history and previous presidential elections into our discussion because you need a frame of reference. The Civil War. Who knew? Who would suspect that the Civil War would become a central issue in the campaign of 2024? Let's put it in context. This last weekend, former President Trump suggested that the Civil War could have been avoided, that it could have been negotiated. And he suggested that had he been there, he would have negotiated a solution. And in fact, that Abraham Lincoln would not have been recognized as a great president because he simply would have been another president, which, by the way, is probably true. Remember that the great presidents of this country, and those of you who've taken my course on the American presidency know, generally achieve greatness because of a war. That's what George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I use those three because they are generally defined as the top three American presidents. The question of the Civil War was raised by Nikki Haley. And again, let me pause and suggest that the battle which is being undertaken now in the caucuses in Iowa, it's a caucus state, not a primary state, that the battle taking place now is a battle in the minds of many for second place. It is Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, versus Nikki Haley, the former governor of South Carolina and ambassador to the United Nations. On Wednesday evening, CNN will hold a debate, which is not really a debate, you understand. It's an opportunity for them to be quizzed, and I believe it's Tapper and Bash who are going to do the question and answers. Donald Trump, who is qualified to participate, has chosen instead to appear on Fox at the same time in a town hall with Bret Baier and one of Bret Baier's colleagues. I'm not sure who it is. It is a battle for second place. Now, if I were quizzing you, I would ask you, does anybody remember who came in second in most primaries or caucuses? And the answer is no. Most people have no memory of Henry Cabot Lodge winning the New Hampshire primary in 1964 on a write-in, or Paul Tsongas winning the New Hampshire primary and went nowhere. The same thing can apply to Iowa caucuses, but you understand why there's a battle for second place. The presumption at this moment is that Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee for president. I'm going to get to that in just a moment, but you understand that there are upsets in presidential elections. What makes it interesting is you never know what's going to come next. And let me give you the best example I can. 1968. Some of you took my course on the making of the president, 1968. And you will recall that if it were January 8th of 1968, I could not have predicted the Tet Offensive. I could not have predicted Eugene McCarthy almost winning the New Hampshire primary. He didn't win it. He came close, but he didn't win it. I could not have predicted that Bobby Kennedy would jump into the presidential campaign. I could not have predicted that Lyndon Johnson on March 31st, 1968 would announce that he would not be a candidate for renomination by the Democratic Party. I could not have predicted the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., nor the assassination of Robert Kennedy. Nor could I have predicted the chaos that would ensue in Chicago during the Democratic National Convention. And most assuredly, nobody predicted that Richard Nixon would emerge as the winner of the 1968 presidential campaign, except for me. I always believed that. But let me try to explain to you what I think is so critical. If anybody tells you that they know what is going to happen, forget it. What do I love about politics? The complete unpredictability of a campaign. So let's roll back again to the question of the Civil War. Who could have anticipated that what happened between 1861 and 1865 would have emerged as a central issue of the campaign of 2024? Not just because of Donald Trump's comments, but because of Nikki Haley's comments. Nikki Haley was asked a simple question. What was the cause of the Civil War? Now, I would love to teach a class on the Civil War because there were many issues involved, but ultimately the issue was slavery. And you may recall Abraham Lincoln's brilliant address prior to his becoming president, that a nation divided against itself cannot stand. House divided against itself cannot stand. A nation cannot exist half slave and half free. The issue of slavery was the core of the whole issue of nullification. Did states have the right to nullify federal law? And lest you think that the Supreme Court was not an issue, let me tell you that in 1857, we inaugurated as President of the United States, James Buchanan. Some of you took my course on the inaugural addresses of the American presidents, and you will note that in Buchanan's very famous inaugural address, he indicated that however the Supreme Court ruled, the country had to abide by the ruling. What was left out was that Buchanan already knew how the Supreme Court was going to rule on Dred Scott. And he decided, because he favored what the Supreme Court was doing, to simply affirm the idea that if the Supreme Court says it, it's the law. And you may recall that the Dred Scott decision, the issue of nullification, the issue of states' rights, all existed around the concept of slavery. And let me remind you of something else. In 1852, the other party in this country was the Whig Party. The Whig Party went down to a crushing defeat. They had nominated Winfield Scott, the great military hero, the man who won, if you will, the Mexican War. And it was presumed that this military hero would carry the Whigs to another victory. Every president who won as a Whig won because they were a military leader. When Scott went down to defeat, the Whig Party fractured. What did it fracture over? The question of slavery. In 1820 was the Missouri Compromise, which kept the country together until the Great Compromise of 1850, which was hobbled together by Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, with the great dissenter John C. Calhoun of South Carolina opposing the compromise. But it kept the country together, and it changed history. But the Whig Party collapsed, and so a new political party was created. And some of you took my course on the history of the Republican Party, one of the most interesting classes to teach. And you understand that the Republican Party was born out of the collapse of the Whigs and the opposition of abolitionists and Northerners to slavery. And so in 1856, the Republican Party ran a candidate for president of the United States, a Californian by the name of John C. Fremont, the great pathfinder. And Fremont, running with Frederick Dayton, was defeated, but he carried most of the North, but he still lost the election. By the way, at that convention, the other candidate for the vice presidential nomination who was considered was Abraham Lincoln. It was his emergence, if you will, which led, of course, to the great Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858. They were not presidential debates. They were debates held in Illinois over a period of time. One of the things I treasure in my library is a first edition printing from 1859 of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And if you read the text, you understand the divisions which existed in the country. And I want you to be clear on this. In the fourth debate at Charleston, Illinois, on September the 18th, 1858, the question of slavery came up. And Abraham Lincoln said that he, as much as any other man, white man, favored the superiority of the white race, that he opposed making voters or jurors of Negroes, that he opposed intermarriage. Abraham Lincoln believed in 1858 in the superiority of the white race. He said, and I, as well as any other man, would favor the superiority of the white race. He was clear. You would have called Lincoln a racist without any question. The Republican Party in 1858 elected people to the House and Senate, and they elected governors. I want you to stop and think for a minute, because there's a lot of talk about third parties, and we're going to talk about third parties. So this is very important. The Republican Party built its base not on a national presidential campaign. They built their base on electing people to the House and the Senate and governorships. And what that meant is that when the 1860 campaign rolled around, the Republican Party had a base. Indeed, they had already elected a Speaker of the House of Representatives. In other words, it was not a party built from the top down. It was built from the bottom up. And when in 1860, the country went to the polls, the Democratic Party was split. It split three ways. They nominated Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois for president. Let me just pull back for a moment. Well, let me do this first. Let me tell you who the candidates were. John C. Breckinridge, the incumbent vice president of the United States, ran as the Southern Democratic candidate for president, and John Bell, the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, ran as the Union Party candidate. And then there were the Republicans. So essentially, the Democrats split in three, which is what allowed Abraham Lincoln to win the election. But I want to remind you of something which goes directly to the issue of a woman's right to choose. And we're going to discuss that in great depth during this class. And that had to do with a view offered by Stephen A. Douglas, who believed in compromise, who wanted to hold the Union together. And he coined a phrase called popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty. The idea was that each state should choose for itself whether to be slave or free. His idea was that if each state could choose for themselves, the Union could be preserved. And that's why Lincoln responded, a house divided against itself cannot stand. A nation cannot exist half slave and half free. It was the assertion by the Republican Party that federal rights were more important than states' rights. It's very important because you're going to hear a lot about that in this campaign over a woman's right to choose. The same issue. What dominates, state rights or national rights? And let me remind you that if the idea of popular sovereignty had prevailed, there never would have been a Roe v. Wade, because each state would be able to decide for itself. What's interesting is that that position, which was the antithesis of Abraham Lincoln's position, leads me to believe that if Abraham Lincoln were alive today, he would have been a Democrat. He would have opposed the idea of popular sovereignty. But understand, in this campaign of 2024, the question of popular sovereignty is real and alive. It rotates primarily around the issue of a woman's right to choose. But if you were a traditional Republican, you would have said, no, There has to be a federal standard. Now, in the battle for the Republican nomination for president, we'll deal with the Democrats in a few minutes, but let's stick with the Republicans for a few minutes. There are several conflicting forces. And this, again, is critical. There are no national party rules for a presidential election. A presidential election is fought state by state. There are some of you who will say that you oppose the Electoral College. We have to amend the Constitution to get rid of the Electoral College. There are some who say, but if all the states agree that the majority should win, it'll never happen. And by the way, I've really thought about this issue. If you are from a small state, the last thing you want is the elimination of the Electoral College, because no candidate for president would ever care about Iowa or Delaware or Hawaii or Alaska or any of the small states. If the Electoral College were eliminated, the only place people would campaign would be in the large states. The mistake that Hillary Clinton made was not campaigning in swing states. On the contrast, let me remind you that there is only one candidate for president of the United States in modern times who campaigned in all 50 states. Richard Nixon, who promised at the Republican Convention of 1960 that he would campaign in all 50 states. And 2 days before the election of 1960, instead of campaigning in Illinois, he flew to Alaska. He carried Alaska and its 3 electoral votes, and he lost Illinois by a hair. In the caucuses taking place in Iowa, and I listened today to several of the new commercials. I want you to know I seriously considered playing the commercials for you, but you can see them on CNN, more on CNN, less on Fox, but you can see them. And one of the pitches made today on behalf of Nikki Haley is that she is a devoted Christian. Why? Because there are 2 key constituencies that the Republican Party needs in order to win an election. And I want you to step back for a moment. I was rereading one of my favorite books, The Making of the President, 1960, by Theodore H. White. I have a copy of that book signed by John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Hubert Humphrey, Adlai Stevenson, Stuart Symington, Eugene McCarthy, Mike Monroney, and inserts from Richard Nixon, Nelson Rockefeller, and Barry Goldwater. In other words, in that one volume are all the key players. By the way, it's also inscribed by Theodore H. White, who said, I am reluctantly returning this volume to you. It's the best collection of autographs I've ever seen. I'd like to keep it for myself, but I won't. In that volume, White points out, and you can read it if you have your copy of The Making of the President, 1960, in the opening pages of the 1960 Republican battle, that the Republican Party was identified as the great liberal party. It was the party that instituted so many things that we now take for granted in dealing with national affairs. It was the party that campaigned for equal rights. Remember, the Southern Democrats didn't. I became a Republican as a kid because I could not vote for a political party that had arch segregationists as its leaders. I couldn't do it. The Republican Party today is built on 2 pillars. One, former Southern Democrats, the old Dixiecrats. Why is this significant? Because in 2 weeks, when we deal with New Hampshire and South Carolina, one of the things you will remember is that the leading South Carolinian politics was a man named Strom Thurmond. Strom Thurmond was a Democrat. He was a governor. He, by the way, was elected to the Senate on a write-in campaign. Write-in campaign, first time he won. He was a segregationist. Forget the fact I interviewed his daughter. He impregnated a black maid in the Thurmond household. And she wrote a book about it. I had the privilege of having her on the air. One of the most interesting interviews, because Strom Thurmond, although he was a segregationist, was a devoted father and put her through college, the whole 9 yards, but it all had to be a secret. Strom Thurmond remained a Democrat until 1964. In 1964, this country passed the first and most important of the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s. There was a Civil Rights Act, remember, in 1957. There was a Civil Rights Act of 1960. Both of them were very weak. The 64 Civil Rights Act is the first real Civil Rights Act with real punch to it. Strom Thurmond voted against the Civil Rights Act, and in fact, as a Democrat, endorsed Barry Goldwater for president of the United States and switched parties. He went from being a Democrat to a Republican. So in 1964, there is that first shift of Southern Democrats becoming Republicans, because Republicans were upholding the principle of states' rights. Barry Goldwater, in his defense, was not opposed to civil rights. He was a life member of the NAACP. He integrated the Goldwater department stores in Arizona. He was viewed as a civil rights hero in a certain sense. He voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because, frankly, he said, you cannot legislate people's hearts. Now, that was the first voting bloc, which caused a huge shift. And all of a sudden, the solid Democratic South became the solid Republican South. But there was a second constituency invited into the Republican Party by Ronald Reagan. And those were the evangelicals. Let me go back for a moment to Jerry Falwell. Jerry Falwell was a Baptist, a Southern Baptist. Did you know that Jerry Falwell endorsed Jimmy Carter for president in 1976? Because Jimmy Carter was a born-again Christian. And just to refresh your memory, how did Jimmy Carter win the Democratic nomination? In 1976, he had two constituencies firmly at his side. The evangelical Christians. He wrote a book called Why Not the Best, published out of Nashville, Tennessee, by an evangelical publishing company. The first time I really heard of Jimmy Carter was walking in, I like going to bookstores, and a lot of the small towns that I would go to didn't have used bookstores. They had Christian bookstores where they sold a whole range of books, including used books, which is what I was looking for. And I would see these huge displays of Jimmy Carter. This was in 1975. He had a solid voting bloc of evangelical Christians. He had a second voting bloc that was equally important. He had Black Americans voting for him. Why? Because as a Southern governor elected in 1970 in Georgia, he had embraced the Black community. He became friendly with Martin Luther King Jr. Sr. and with Coretta Scott King, and he embraced the Black community. So he walked in to the primary and into the caucuses with a firm base of people who would vote for him. And then he got a lucky break. George Wallace was emerging as a powerful contender for the Democratic nomination in 1976. Remember, the attempted assassination took place in Maryland in the spring of 1976. Until that moment, George Wallace was a real contender for the Democratic nomination for president. He, by the way, scored more popular votes cumulatively in the primary than any other potential Democratic candidate for president, just so you know that. But organized labor absolutely opposed George Wallace. And so organized labor backed Jimmy Carter in the primary. Had there been an alternative, but they had to stop Wallace, and they did it in Florida. Now, you're probably saying, why am I giving you all this arcane stuff? And the answer is because if you want to understand what's happening right now, you have to understand what happened then. In Iowa, the base of the voters are evangelical Christians. What happens in church is more important than anywhere else. But wait, what about the Black community, if that was part of Jimmy Carter's coalition? Why do you think that Joe Biden spoke in a nationally televised address today in South Carolina? Because for him, the Black community is critical. So Democrats and Republicans today still look to interest groups to win. Joe Biden would never have won the South Carolina primary 4 years ago had not Jim Clyburn, who was on television again today, endorsed him. That is why Joe Biden was nominated by the Democratic Party for president. So those constituencies in 1976, which were so critical for Jimmy Carter, have now fractured. There is no more evangelical wing of the Democratic Party. They are all in the Republican Party. And both Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis are claiming the evangelical voters as their own. Black voters are sticking now with the Democrats overwhelmingly. And they are the bedrock of Joe Biden's support. And let me not leave out Kamala Harris, who is an African American in part, and who I've worked with very closely over the years, and I know her very well. Her sorority in college is the best organized group in South Carolina. So somebody asked me, if Joe Biden for some reason bowed out, and we're going to get to that, and Nikki Haley ran, she would win the South Carolina primary for sure. All of this may sound arcane, but if you connect all the dots, you understand now why the Democratic Party is the party of the left or the liberals, and the Republican Party is the right, the conservatives, the evangelical Christians, and the remainder of the segregationist forces. Who was Nikki Haley speaking to when she did not say slavery as the cause of the Civil War? Remember, she was governor of South Carolina. Remember, she's the one who took the Confederate flag off the state building. She was talking to her own voters. Why? And by the way, in 2 weeks, we'll get into this even more. Can a person be nominated for the presidency of the United States if they lose the primary in their own state? Nikki Haley was talking not to the voters of Iowa, not to the voters of New Hampshire. she is talking to the voters of South Carolina. And by the way, the issue of a woman's right to choose will be central in Florida. That's why Ron DeSantis is being pro-life, but to a point. Because on the ballot in November will be a question, the same one that appeared in 7 other states, guaranteeing the right of a woman to have an abortion. It'll be on the ballot in Florida. So do you understand that these candidates for president all are dealing with history? All are dealing with the fact that in order to gain traction, they have to carry their own states. Pause. Who is ahead in South Carolina? Donald Trump. If Donald Trump wins in South Carolina, I will predict, and remember, this is being taped, so you will be able to tell me how wrong I was, which is fine, because all I'm giving you are my assessments based on my own political instinct and what I know. If Nikki Haley loses in South Carolina, she is toast. But if Ron DeSantis loses in Florida, he's finished too. So there are high stakes in all of this. Now, I want to talk for a moment, and I have to leave time for questions. So I'm going to do my best, and I know you're all thinking. I want to think for a moment about the vulnerabilities of Donald Trump. This morning, Donald Trump's lawyers filed a brief, which actually they filed it in Georgia, dealing with the Georgia legal problems that Donald Trump has, but it will be considered tomorrow by a district court national. Does a president of the United States have immunity from prosecution for what he did while he was in office? Now, I want to pause here. Some of you asked me coming in whether I would ever teach my course on Richard Nixon again. It is entirely appropriate to talk about Richard Nixon. When the Supreme Court acts, and it could happen within the next 2 weeks, it could happen a little bit later, but it's going to happen. The question of immunity. I want you to know that Derek has already guaranteed me immunity on anything I may say in this class. Derek, thank you. I worked for Richard Nixon. All of you know that I am considered one of the people who's one of the great experts on Richard Nixon. It's a fascinating subject for me to discuss. When Richard Nixon became president of the United States, he installed a taping system in the Oval Office. By the way, he had taken out the taping system of Lyndon Johnson's, which was a better taping system. If you listen to the Johnson tapes, they're very clear. You listen to the Nixon tapes, it's a lot tougher. But Nixon recorded everything for a period of time in his administration. The most damning tape, which cost him the presidency, was the June 23rd, 1972 tape of a conversation between Richard Nixon and Bob Haldeman. You can hear that recording by going on YouTube and just Googling the June 23rd tape, in which Nixon and Haldeman conspire to prevent the investigation, FBI, CIA, of the Watergate investigation. This tape was revealed. Now, before I get to the nub of it, I want you to understand Richard Nixon had nominated, and justices had been approved by the United States Senate. I never say appointed because no president appoints, they nominate. The Senate has the power of advise and consent. 4 of Nixon's nominees for the court were approved by the Senate. When the United States versus Richard Nixon became a case of note, one justice, William Rehnquist, who was then an associate justice of the United States Supreme Court, but who had worked in the Nixon Justice Department, recused himself. We'll talk about Clarence Thomas in a minute. Recused himself because he said, I know all of these people. These are all people I work with. I should not be involved in this case. Nixon and his lawyers built a solid case for something called executive privilege. Executive privilege says that what a president of the United States does is privileged and should be confidential. When the Supreme Court debated the United States versus Richard Nixon, it was a very narrow case. It was not a case dealing with broader presidential power. It had a simple bottom line. Should a president of the United States who commits a crime, which can be proved, be guaranteed executive privilege? Under the thesis of Donald Trump's lawyers in their brief today in Georgia and their brief before the district court, Richard Nixon would never have been revealed on that June 23rd tape. Because under the idea of presidential immunity, Richard Nixon's tapes would have been maintained as confidential, and therefore we never would have known. And I must tell you, remember this, if it was John Dean's word versus Richard Nixon's words, and there had been no tapes, John Dean would have had no impact at all. There had to be evidence, hard evidence. The battle that is taking place now over the question of removing Donald Trump from the ballot over insurrection, we'll get to that in a minute too, is this case of immunity is even more important. Let me explain that if the Supreme Court votes on precedent, the United States versus Richard Nixon, there is no way that Donald Trump can win. If existing precedent matters to this court, Donald Trump cannot prevail. But now let's talk about it, and we have lawyers who are here in the room. What happens when existing precedent is thrown out? You remember on Roe v. Wade, each of the nominees suggested by Donald Trump said they hadn't made up their mind, but we all knew that they had. And it was proven. They lied. Thank God this is on tape. Because of course they didn't tell the truth. The question will be whether or not this court will overturn an existing precedent, the United States versus Richard Nixon. And let me explain what makes this case different than others. What makes this case different than others is it will establish a precedent dealing with future presidencies. If a president is above the law, and you may refer, you can Google this as well, in the David Frost interviews. David Frost asked Nixon, who was then a former president, about whether or not if a president did it, was it illegal? And Nixon responded, if a president does it, it's not illegal. It is the same principle that Donald Trump is advocating. Now, to be fair, there is a case to be made that a president of the United States should not be prosecuted for things that they do while they're in office. I can think of things that were done by presidents that were unconscionable. But there is a certain amount of immunity. But here's another question. What happens if the president is accused of doing something that is not within the confines of his presidential duties? Is a phone call to the Secretary of State of Georgia that is recorded, asking for more votes, something that is part of presidential duties. No, you're laughing, but that is what the United States Supreme Court will have to determine. Now, remember that my old friend, Bill Rehnquist, and I knew him over many years through Republican politics. I was with him here in San Francisco in 1964 when he worked for Barry Goldwater. Bill Rehnquist recused himself because he said, I am too familiar with all of this. And I know the people. These are friends of mine. Haldeman, Ehrlich, Colson. He recused himself. The argument can be made that Clarence Thomas has the same basic conflict of interest. In fact, his wife was a leading election denier. Should he recuse himself? Well, there was just a letter written by 7 members of the United States Senate, all Democrats, saying absolutely. But do you understand? Push comes to shove. No one can force him to recuse himself. Remember that. So the question the Supreme Court will deal with is the question of immunity. Really, the question is a president of the United States above the law? There are arguments, legitimate arguments, made saying that Donald Trump should be protected. And the question will be posed, if he loses, what does that mean for future presidents of the United States? Particularly, unlike the Nixon case, which was delimited to a narrow question, whether or not this could be a broader interpretation with a major impact on the American presidents. Now, I want to deal with one more thing before we take the break. And that is the question of insurrection. We spoke about the Civil War. Let me remind you that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution were passed as a result of the Civil War. Let me remind you that the 14th Amendment, Section 3, which you can look up, says that someone who participates in insurrection should be barred from holding office. Now, I want to recommend a book to everybody. It is a partisan view without question. But if this were a class where I could require reading, it would be Liz Cheney's new book, which I have read, and I must tell you, I consider it to be an American classic. Having said that, I would never vote for Liz Cheney for anything, because I disagree with her on virtually every key major issue. But she deserved, and some of you who listen to me on the radio knew that I was one of the first to nominate her for the Profiles in Courage Award from the John F. Kennedy Library, which she won. Very happy that I participated in that. I'm proud of that. Oath and Honor is the title of Liz Cheney's book. Buy it. Read it. But here's the question. If, as the Colorado Supreme Court ruled on a 4-3 decision, if Donald Trump really committed an act of insurrection, or if, as the Maine Secretary of State, who is not elected, she is appointed, and is a partisan Democrat, she ruled him off the ballot because of insurrection, and if in Oregon, the ultimate determination is to eliminate him from the ballot for insurrection, Is that a legitimate use of the 14th Amendment, Section 3? Now, here in California, our Secretary of State, a partisan Democrat, declined to remove Donald Trump from the ballot. The reason, the argument being made by many, is that it is better to have the people vote than the courts rule. In 2000, when I was teaching here at the Fromm, and we considered the case of Bush v. Gore, the indignation over the court decision on a 5-4 split decision, and I would remind you, just so you know this, Sandra Day O'Connor just died. You remember on election night when they announced that Gore had won in Florida, she stormed out of the room furious. And it was her vote, which was decisive in the election, that put Bush in the White House. Should she have recused herself? Clarence Thomas, by the way, the last sitting member of the court right now, who have been there in 2000, he and his family participated actively in the Bush campaign. Should he have recused himself? And I would invite you all to read what I think is one of the greatest dissents ever offered by San Francisco's own Stephen Breyer in that case. But it is a question. Shall the people rule? Is it up to the people, or is it up to the courts to make the decision? And the Supreme Court of the United States is on trial. The question of immunity, question of insurrection, will ultimately be decided by the highest court in the land. Now, listen carefully to what I'm going to say. Whatever the court does will make the Supreme Court a decisive question before the American people when we teach the second half of this class beginning in September. Oh, I have to give you a break. I do so with the deepest reluctance. We'll see you in 10 minutes. Not more, not more.
All of your points are being made. My, and I find myself yelling at the TV.
2 minutes, 2 minutes.
Okay.
And there's no emphasis. Ladies and gentlemen, if you'll take your seats, please.
No, isn't that mute for us? Is that for us? Okay, then try it. So let's see. Maybe when his lips move, we'll look.
I want to correct myself. And by the way, I do this without notes. I have to confess to you that I walk in not quite sure what I want to do. But somebody pointed out that by mistake, I said Nikki Haley when I was talking about South Carolina and losing there. And I just wanted to correct myself right there. Okay. Now, there are questions. Oh, the correction was that I said that Nikki Haley would not be able to win, or would win the primary. And I tried in South Carolina, and I tried to explain that's exactly the point, that Trump may well win in South Carolina, which would eliminate her from, well, it wouldn't eliminate her from the vice presidency, but that's another question. Okay. Let me, I'm going to first take questions. I've got a few here that came in from people who were not here. And then are you going to circulate a microphone? Okay, let me answer these first. Matt asks, wasn't Lincoln left off the ballot in 10 Southern slave states in 1860? The answer is yes. When Lincoln won the majority of the South had never heard of him because he wasn't even on the ballot. No, they'd heard of him because everybody knew about the Lincoln-Douglas debates. That was a major catalyst for getting Lincoln the nomination. And the South opposed him because he had declared so firmly that he was opposed to secession. And the second question here, George asks, would you like to make a prediction on how the Supreme Court will rule on the question of immunity? I'd like to make a prediction. And I will repeat this because I think it's really important. If the court follows existing law, they will rule against Donald Trump. But we learned with Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, and then Roe v. Wade, 1954, and then, of course, the Dobbs decision, that this court does not view itself as bound by precedent. Therefore, I won't make a prediction. I know what I believe the court should do, and that is reject the notion of presidential immunity. But no one knows what these justices will do. But okay, you want two predictions? I'll give you my predictions, and you'll tell me I'm wrong. It's okay. I think they will reject the idea of Trump being removed from the ballot on the question of insurrection, unless there is a conviction in a court of law. On immunity, if they do the right thing, in my judgment, they will uphold the United States versus Richard Nixon. Okay, you're going to circulate. And many of you came up to me. Really, it's not that I want to be rude, but I won't answer questions during the break. I'm going to tell you the same thing. Anyone who asks me, ask me in class. That's what makes the class interesting. Go ahead.
Is this the scariest presidential election in your lifetime? In
contemplating how I would begin this class, I came up with an opening line, which you will note I did not use. Every presidential election is viewed as the most important election in history. And every election is the most important in history. This election is critical to the future of America. And I opened with the idea that you have two contrasting points of view. Forget about the personalities. Think only of the substance. Donald Trump claims he won the election 4 years ago and that a great disservice was done to the American people. Joe Biden views those kinds of comments and their support as anti-democratic, small d. That's the contrast. So if you ask me, is this the most important election? The answer is yes. At this time, at this place, because of the issues involved. And for somebody like me, who not only teaches a class, but who does a daily podcast, Around the Political World with John Rothmann, 10 minutes every morning, I will never be at a loss for words. And you'll notice I'm not using any script here at all. I don't have to use a script. The events unfolding allow us all to consider them carefully. Next question.
Is there such a thing as immunity?
Why is there such a thing as immunity? The answer is because what presidents do very often in a normal course of life would be terrible. So if a president orders a bombing, should a president be indicted for murder? Let me remind you, Henry Kissinger just passed away. There was a move in the international court to indict both Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger for what happened in Vietnam. Telford Taylor, who was one of the prosecutors at the Nuremberg trials, wrote a book in which he suggests that Nixon and Kissinger committed war crimes. The reason there is immunity is to guarantee a president the ability to act and react. I'm in favor of executive privilege. I'm in favor of immunity, unless a law is broken. Please remember, had Donald Trump's argument been proven during the Nixon years, Nixon would have finished his term in office. We would never have known about the abuses of presidential power. But it was not the crimes that may have been committed in terms of war crimes by Nixon and Kissinger, the overthrow of Allende in Chile, well, you can go through a whole list of things. It had to do with the fact that he conspired to overthrow, if you will, American democracy. I recommended Liz Cheney's book because her contention is that that's what Donald Trump tried to do. And if I could have, I would have played for an hour, maybe somebody will pull it up, Coup, which was broadcast in a repeat on CNN last night. It is a scathing indictment of Donald Trump. But in turn, what you have to understand is there are people who reject that notion and who believe with perfect faith. I'm not going to say it's half the country, but 30%, 40% believe that Donald Trump won the election, believe that he did the right thing. We talked about the Electoral College. When I first heard of this idea of phony electors, and people made this argument, well, it's not the first time different sets of electors have been submitted. 1960, Hawaii, Nixon electors and Kennedy electors were both submitted. Who won Hawaii in 1960? I really can't tell you, but I can tell you I spoke with Richard Nixon about it. And I asked, why didn't you contest it? You carried Hawaii. He said, John, even if they proved I carried Hawaii, it wouldn't have mattered. I lost the election. So it's a question of putting things in perspective. Does that answer the question? Next.
You said you were in favor of immunity unless the law is broken. Doesn't immunity sort of imply that a law was broken? You have immunity from a crime, but also is theoretically isn't the remedy against impunity impeachment?
Okay, it's a great question. Thank you. First of all, one of the arguments that Donald Trump is making against what has happened in Colorado and in Maine is that he was impeached, the second impeachment, and he was acquitted. So let's draw a sharp distinction between an impeachment, and those of you who've heard me talk about impeachment, and I've spoken about it here extensively, impeachment is a political process. It is not a legal process. It is purely political. In the end, Richard Nixon left office because Barry Goldwater, and I'll never forget this, I was sitting with Senator Goldwater, and I asked him about his consequential meeting with Nixon on August the 8th, 1974. And Goldwater described the scene to me. He said Nixon had his feet up on the desk in the Oval Office. And he went around the room, what's the situation? There were three Republicans in the room. Hugh Scott, the Republican leader in the Senate, John Rhodes, the Republican leader in the House, and Barry Goldwater, who was invited along because he'd been the Republican nominee for president in 1964, and he was Mr. Republican, Mr. Conservative. And finally, President Nixon looked at Goldwater and said, Barry, how do I stand? Now, let me remind you, Nixon won the nomination in 1968. Those of you who took my course on the campaign of 68 know this, because of Barry Goldwater and Strom Thurmond. The South wanted to defect to Ronald Reagan. They stayed with Nixon. Nixon won on the first ballot by 25 votes. That was it. Had Nixon not won on the first ballot, Reagan would have been the nominee in 1968. Goldwater turned to Nixon and said, Mr. President, remember, he made him president. Mr. President, you have 7 votes in the Senate at most, and I am not one of them. I believe, as I believe with Richard Nixon, that what matters is what happens in court. Now, I'm going to correct an illusion, a myth, that you cannot pardon someone, if you're president, without an admission of guilt. You can. Bob Haldeman called Air Force One as Nixon was flying back to California. He was still president until he hit Missouri. In Missouri, he lost the presidency. Resignation took effect. Haldeman wanted Nixon to simply write on a napkin, I pardon the following people. He could have. The call was never put through, and Nixon had already made the decision, according to people who I know who were involved, that he would not issue such a pardon, including, by the way, Haldeman said, pardon yourself. I believe that the truth about Donald Trump must be proven in a court of law. If he committed an act of insurrection, let the charge be brought against him and let him be convicted. Then the 14th Amendment, Section 3 might apply. But I believe the court will say there is no conviction here. There's only opinion. And the January 6th report is an opinion. Liz Cheney's book is an opinion. What about immunity in general? If I could teach a course on the presidency as it should be taught, I would tell you that every day presidents make decisions which may be against the law. Everybody has to understand that when you're president of the United States, you make day-to-day decisions, some of which may not be legal. in the technical sense. But our decision as a nation was to trust the person who is president of the United States and say to them, make the decision you think is right. You will be judged by the voters, or you won't be judged by the voters because you can't run for a third term anymore. But in the end, I think it's very important that a president have that flexibility. And then if we disagree with the president, fine. And now we know. Do you remember in the case of Nixon that he was an unindicted co-conspirator? Are you aware that Donald Trump was indicted as an unindicted co-conspirator? And that precedent was set by Leon Jaworski. I spoke with Jaworski about it. His view was that a sitting president of the United States should not be indicted, that you could be indicted once you left office. And when Gerald Ford made the decision to pardon Richard Nixon for any crime that Nixon might have committed between January 20th, 1969, when he took office, and August 9th, 1974, when he left office, what Ford asked for was a letter from Nixon admitting that he had done things which might be wrong. He would not have granted the pardon to Nixon had not such a letter been produced. And I want to deal with one more thing. We had a candidate for president of the United States who ran as the Socialist Party candidate for president in 1920. His name was Eugene Victor Debs. He was indicted and convicted of sedition during the First World War. The president, by the way, in that election, 1920, Eugene V. Debs received almost 1 million votes. From prison, a Republican by the name of Warren G. Harding granted not a pardon, but clemency to Eugene V. Debs on Christmas Eve, 1921. So the conviction was not erased, but clemency was granted and Debs was able to go home for Christmas. The whole question of Donald Trump and his guilt or innocence may be resolved, if not during these class sessions, certainly by September, in the second part of this class. And if someone were to ask me whether I favored a pardon, if he were convicted, that would be enough for me. I have no desire to see him sit in prison. Nixon never went to prison, but let me assure you, he was in prison the rest of his life, even with a pardon. So I would grant clemency. Next question, sorry.
I don't know if I need this, but here I go. A little pushback, Professor.
Of course,
Many people who were with Donald Trump say that he acknowledged that he did not win the election.
Mhm.
Now, I don't know if this is, I think this is recorded, these kinds of things that he did say. So frankly, maybe because the 14th Amendment does not require a conviction, we should all know that he is guilty, and maybe the Congress ought to make that decision. Also, we do not vote directly for president, and this is a big problem because all sorts of shenanigans go on. You know that, right?
Yeah. Let me tell you, I love you. It is a,
I love
it
you
is a,
too,
it is
but
a,
I'm not going to sit here because you're very knowledgeable.
no, this is a marvelous question, which I want to answer and answer directly.
Okay,
I think I said earlier that unless he is convicted by a court of insurrection, you're exactly right. The Congress will not pass a law because the Constitution has a provision What has to happen is that a court of law has to concur that what happened on January 6th was an insurrection. And while it is true that people in the Trump circle, including some of his top aides, concede the fact that he lost the election, it's hearsay. And you cannot convict somebody on hearsay. But I had a conversation yesterday with a leading figure in the anti-Trump movement within the Republican Party. And I said, if I were in charge, I would have each one of these people, former cabinet officials, former senators, former chiefs of staff, all attest to the fact that Trump said he lost. They should attest to the fact that Donald Trump tried to subvert an election. And those should be commercials used against Trump if he's the Republican nominee for president. But in turn, so we're fair, because I want to try to be fair, Donald Trump has the right, indeed the obligation, to do what he is doing now. He said, I was never involved in insurrection. I never did anything wrong. Of course, it reminds me of the little boy at the cookie jar who has crumbs all over his clothes, who says, I didn't do it. Circumstantial evidence. So my answer to you is, this is not something the Congress will do. It is something the courts will do. And if the courts believe the evidence exists, Donald Trump will be convicted. Next question.
To ask you about Barry Goldwater. And you said that when you were talking about the Dixiecrats and the, when you were talking about the Dixiecrats, you kind of went over, you just kind of bypassed him. But wasn't he involved with the evangelicals?
Let me explain this question about my differentiation between evangelicals and Dixiecrats. The Dixiecrats were not evangelicals. The Dixiecrats believed that each state should decide for itself whether or not there should be segregation. You will read, when you look it up, these are all my little extra classroom assignments for you, the Southern Manifesto, which was issued in 1956, which was a declaration by a majority, overwhelming majority of Southern senators and members of the House, denying the idea that the Supreme Court would rule in Brown versus the Board of Education, and urging, thank you, Carl, and urging resistance. Their argument was that the court should not be able to impose such a ruling on the people. Is that legitimate? Well, the American people said, no, it isn't. But how powerful is the Supreme Court? As somebody who defended Roe v. Wade publicly from the time it was implemented in 1973, should we have resisted the Supreme Court decision on Dobbs? I refer you to Al Gore's concession speech, one of the greatest speeches ever delivered by a defeated candidate for president. Just Google it, Al Gore concession speech. And he says, I don't agree with the decision of the Supreme Court, but I will abide by the decision of the Supreme Court. What has held us together as a nation is our obedience to the rule of law. The argument which Joe Biden made in Delaware is that Donald Trump does not follow the law. Donald Trump's response is, you're the one breaking the law by weaponizing the Justice Department. Who will decide? The American people. Do court convictions mandate action in regard to eligibility to run for president? Phil asks. The answer is, if you are convicted of a crime, you cannot run. If Donald Trump is guilty of insurrection, he will be knocked off the ballot. He has to be convicted. That is what the court, I believe, will rule. And may I say, that is the correct ruling. It is not my opinion or your opinion. It is the law. Not a question, but a comment. It is remarkable to me how prescient the authors of the Federalist Papers were in anticipating Donald Trump. I have a copy of the Federalist Papers, which is now claimed by the Republicans as the Holy Grail, signed by Adlai Stevenson in 1952. And the inscription reads, roughly, every American should read and debate the Federalist Papers. And I think that's absolutely true. But do you remember the idea of the Federalist Papers? There was opinion and there was dissent. And that's part of the American process. Let me tell you what really worries me. What worries me is you have to have a conclusion. If you take a look at presidential concession speeches, and on YouTube you can find all the modern presidential concession speeches, everyone who lost the election conceded that they lost. In modern time, there is only one candidate for president who, having been defeated, continues to state that he won the election. And that's Donald Trump. We have only one other example in history, 1876. Samuel J. Tilden versus Rutherford B. Hayes. I referred to it earlier. Tilden won the election popular vote by 250,000 votes, but there were something called the Electoral Commission, which was supposed to be evenly divided, 15 members, but it turned out there were 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. And all of the disputed electoral votes went to Hayes. So he won the election 185 to 184. And Hayes was referred to by many during his presidency as your fraudulency. I say this because what is it that maintains American equilibrium? Not public opinion. That's the voice of somebody here who believes in public opinion. No, it's the law. It's the law. We may not agree with all the interpretations of the law. And if I were teaching a course on the Supreme Court, I would remind you when Franklin Roosevelt wanted to pack the Supreme Court. There's a wonderful book by Turner Catledge and Stuart Alsop called 168 Days. It was published in 1938 or 39. I have a copy signed by Turner Catledge. And when you read it, it is the most remarkable story of Franklin Roosevelt who decided to pack the court. When Franklin Roosevelt died, of the 9 justices, 8 had been Roosevelt nominees, and the one who wasn't, Roosevelt nominated to be Chief Justice. He was an appointment of Calvin Coolidge, nominee of Calvin. It isn't that we agree with decisions, but in the end, unless we comply, you have another civil war. So, why will the Supreme Court be such a critical issue in the campaign of 2024, which we will be talking about as time goes on? Because Donald Trump is going to argue, if he loses, that the people he put on the court were not grateful. He's already saying it. His people are already saying it. But on the other hand, if Donald Trump wins, the indignation of many in this country will be overwhelming. That brings us back to Dred Scott, 1857. It might have brought us to Brown versus the Board of Education. Read the Southern Manifesto, which is why I go back to Al Gore, who will be remembered in history for having accepted an unjust verdict in the minds of Al Gore and his supporters. Next question. Oh, over there.
After the 14th Amendment was passed, weren't there some Southern insurrectionists who were barred from office, and were they convicted in a court of law?
The question is clear, and the answer is yes. People who served as officers of the Confederacy were barred from holding political office. People who served in the Confederate Army were not. We had a number of Confederate generals who went on to serve honorably in the Congress. What was Lincoln's point? Have you read Lincoln's second inaugural address? To bind up the nation's wounds. Lincoln was not vindictive. In his first inaugural address before the Civil War, he appeals, do not leave the Union. We are brothers. In the end, people who served in the Civil War and the Confederacy were allowed to vote. Pardons were issued. Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, was not prosecuted. These are determinations which need to be made in a rational, reasonable way. When Donald Trump this morning referred to the people who were tried and convicted as being hostages, and he said, come on, Joe, you can deal with it. I was appalled. And I'll tell you what else appalls me. When the suggestion is made by a former president of the United States that if he returns to the Oval Office, there will be pardons for people who participated in the activities of January 6th. Those are legitimate issues to be put before the American people. If I were running the campaign against Donald Trump, I would make those arguments with all the eloquence I could muster. If I were in defense of Donald Trump, his arguments are clear. And let's remind everybody that at least 40% of this country, if you believe the polls today, support Donald Trump's positions. Because it's not rational. You know, the toughest thing to do in your life, the toughest thing for people to do is to say they're wrong. Hard to say, I made a mistake. The Trump voters believe with perfect faith that they did not make a mistake. They believe with perfect faith that Donald Trump was the greatest president in their lifetime, and if not one of the greatest presidents in the history of this country. And one of the arguments which will be made, and it was made to me very eloquently by a Trump supporter, forget January 6th, think about what he accomplished as president. Vote for him because of that. Now, I know that in this room, I know that in San Francisco, that would be a minority opinion. But were I to speak about this in Indiana, or in Iowa, or in Nebraska, or in Alabama, or in Mississippi, they would say to me, you are wrong. They would say it with the same conviction, with the same passion that we would express an alternative point of view. My job in this class is to try to present both points of view, and I will do that. What I wanted to do today was to lay a foundation for all of our discussion. When we meet in 2 weeks, the caucuses will have taken place. Donald Trump may be ordained as the Republican candidate for president after New Hampshire and South Carolina. We will still have to talk about it. And let me tell you what I didn't get to today, because I see I have to stop. I hate the clock. I didn't talk about the Democrats. We have not talked about the question of Joe Biden. And I remarked to somebody, Joe Biden is 81 years old. If he were 18, nobody would be questioning his fitness. Of course, he couldn't serve as president. He's got to be how old to be president? 35. Okay. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is not within the purview of my power to stop the news in the next 2 weeks. Your job and mine is to listen to the news, and I gave you a homework assignment. When you go home, write down questions that you think we should deal with in this class. I will try to answer those questions or deal with them, but that's your responsibility. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for a splendid morning.
Thank you everyone on Zoom for joining us today, also for writing questions in the chat, and know that you can always do so, and I will relay those to Professor Rothmann. And also please remember that next Monday is a holiday, so there will be no Zoom class tomorrow. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you had a good class. See you later. Bye-bye.
Hope you're enjoying it.
Assignment is just to keep a kind of a serene mental